Coast. Eric's presentation is part of our special series of educational webinars and culinary demonstrations for our first annual virtual avocado festival in 2020. You can find audio and video for this and all of our presentations by visiting ceorange.edu/avocado festival. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Eric Vogt. Eric has been with Dr. Mary Lou Arpaia's UC Riverside Avocado Lab since 1999. Eric's interest lies in fruit characteristics and diversity here in California. Eric's talk today, History of Avocado Varieties and Their Improvement in California, will discuss the history of avocado breeding efforts with a focus on the UC Riverside Scion Breeding Program. He'll also talk about aspects of avocado physiology that make breeding particularly challenging and also showcase a few of the commonly available and recently released California avocado varieties. Thank you again, Eric. Take it away.
Thank you, Jason and Tammy, for inviting me. I'm always excited to share our research and all the great varieties in California. Like Jason said, my project or my presentation is on the history of avocado varieties and their improvement in California. So I'm going to sort of give you an overview of the sort of prehistory or the pre-California history of avocados, where they came from originally, the history of their introduction to the state of California, and then some physiological facts about them as well, issues of fruit and flower development and other things like that that we're interested in and that sort of apply to the varieties I'll be talking about. But I'm going to introduce some varieties as well, some sort of key California varieties that you may find at your local nursery or potentially in grocery stores or farmers markets. And I'm going to sort of introduce those in sequence chronologically, sort of as they sort of developed in California, and explain why they're sort of good sort of representatives of that time frame and their historical place in the state's avocado history. So avocados, although they've been grown for at least thousands, tens of thousands of years in Central America and Mexico as a sort of dooryard tree, semi-domesticated, they're a new crop to California and to sort of commercial agriculture. They've only been really grown commercially for a little over 100 years. However, they have, like I said, history from well before that. These are actually some specimens at the local Riverside. I'm from Riverside right now, Riverside Municipal Museum. And as you can see, although corn is sort of the most famous New World crop as far as like global production, et cetera, they were growing avocados as well at a very early stage. And so we talk about this sort of early history of avocados. The Mayan groups were one of the first to sort of semi-domesticate or try to grow this tree intentionally. And you can see actually the figures here. This is a tomb inscription from, I think, the Palenque. It's a tomb about from 650 AD, and it's actually a stylized avocado. And if you can see in here, there's, I can move my mouse around, there's these little, these are stylized leaves, and you can actually see little fruits. There's 3 fruits, and she's holding one here as well. So avocado was at least a culturally significant tree to these peoples. And they also engaged in this sort of form of silviculture, I guess you would say, where there's a sort of walled kind of garden that they would grow in the Mayan cultural region called a pet cut. And they would take trees from different regions that they were interested in or that had significance to them, either for medicinal or food purposes, and they would grow them often outside of their natural range throughout the Mayan area. So this is sort of like the earliest, I'd say, attempts at domestication of avocado, and it's been around for quite a while. However, for Western purposes, the sort of first big cultural encounter that a lot of Europeans had with avocado was through the Aztec Empire in Mexico. And this is where we sort of developed our current understanding as well of there being sort of 3 subspecies of avocado, which I'll get to a little later, because the Aztecs themselves had 3 different names for 3 different types of avocado that roughly represent the 3 subspecies as we understand them today. And so we talk about where is the original home of the avocado, and this is a map adapted from a story in 1986, and the varieties we have in California were mostly the Mexican, which is purple here, and the Guatemalan subspecies. That's where the majority of our material comes from. But there's another, the 3rd subspecies is a very important subspecies. It's a lowland, more tropical species that grows in warmer, more tropical climates. At the time that this map was generated, the understanding was that this subspecies had originated on the Pacific coast in the lowlands. But there wasn't really any genetic or biological or diversity sort of evidence of that. It was more ethno-cultural stuff. And in recent years, there's been some further speculation that actually there's a lot of evidence that it may be originated in the Yucatan Peninsula or somewhere in the Caribbean area under Mayan cultivation or pre-Mayan cultivation. So that's why there's a question mark there. There's a lot of stuff we still don't know about avocados. So there's a lot of research to do. So when we talk about these 3 different subspecies, there's only one true species though, which is Persea americana. So basically there's 3 major subspecies, but they all can easily cross. You can generate hybrids from them. So when early innovators and growers in California began to think about what avocado types they wanted to bring to the state, they focused on those subspecies that had a climate region that was more close to California. And for that reason, they focused on the Mexican and Guatemalan subspecies. So you can see over here that these are sort of the tree traits. These are the more cold tolerant of the 3 subspecies. But they also have different fruit qualities as well. Guatemalan subspecies tends to have a larger fruit, usually green-skinned and a thicker peel, whereas the Mexican subspecies has a smaller fruit with very thin skin, often smooth and shiny. Sometimes you can actually even eat the skin of some of the Mexican subspecies. And also they have different fruit maturity seasons as well. The Guatemalan subspecies is much longer to mature on the tree. It can stay on the tree for over a year in some cases. The 3rd subspecies I have up here, the West Indian, we have some of those in our collections, but they don't do so well in California. They don't like the cold, obviously, but there's been a recent interest in them, a lot for producing rootstocks, which I'll get into later, for their salt tolerance, but also for just in general their salt tolerance, because that is one of the issues that we're coming across in California is decreasing water quality and availability for crops. And so we would like to have avocados and other plants that are better able to make use of reclaimed water or more salty water. So previously there was not a lot of interest in West Indian here, but recently there's been a sort of reinvigorated interest. But for our purposes in California, the fruit trees and avocados primarily come from the Guatemalan and Mexican background. And you can see in this old picture, this is pretty typical over here of Guatemalan, wild Guatemalan type. You can see a lot of these wild avocados as well have a very large seed. And so that's one of the things that domestication has done is reduce the seed size. But like these wild Guatemalan types have a round, large fruit, whereas over here this is more Mexican style. It's a smaller fruit, and that's where California's material comes from. But it's also important to remember that like in the early 1900s, late 1800s, when people were starting to be interested in avocado, that they brought material from all over. California is a dynamic, I guess, sort of seaport or coastal region. So material was brought up, for example, in this slide here. these fruit were actually brought up as seed from Santiago, Chile. And the avocado as well dates into South America pre-Columbian. It was introduced there before Europeans arrived. And so when growers and fruit explorers and horticulturalists were looking for varieties they thought would do well in California, if they saw something in Chile or Argentina or Ecuador that they thought looked like a Mexican or Guatemalan or was growing in a colder region, that would still make its way up to California. So it became a sort of melting pot of different genetic backgrounds, mainly Guatemalan and Mexican subspecies. So this is sort of the early history of California's experimentation with avocados. The first recorded evidence I could find for someone trying to grow avocado was for 1856. There was a Dr. Thomas J. White in the San Gabriel Valley. There's a reference that Wilson Popenoe, as a famous fruit explorer, mentioned in the 1930s that this was the earliest he could find evidence. But it's just a description that this person brought in the seed and planted it from Nicaragua, and there was no further record of it. So the speculation was that this was before people in California realized that there were these different subspecies and that this was perhaps a West Indian subspecies, so it did not do well. So later, in the 1870s, Judge R.B. Ord up in Santa Barbara, he actually had family and friends in Mexico. And so he was a little more familiar with the range of avocado traits. And so he was the first person in California to successfully bring up seedling trees, planted the seeds, and in Santa Barbara, these 3 trees grew, and they actually bore fruit. And this is, from what I can tell, the earliest fruit that was born in California, successful fruiting. And so this piqued a lot of interest in other people because they came to see Judge Ord's trees. And one of those people as famous as Juan Murrieta, who was a rancher, a shepherder. Actually, the city of Murrieta is named after Juan Murrieta. And he had contacts in at least Mexico with the post office, I think, and some friends. And he would import seeds and fruit from Mexico, try to sell some of it in the local markets here, but also just he's interested himself in planting out seeds and trying to grow material. We actually have one of his selections in our collection. It's called Murrieta Green. And so this is like some of the very earliest attempts at growing the fruit here in California. Another famous person, not just for avocado, is Francesco Franceschi. He brought in a lot of subtropical and tropical material here to California. So he was responsible for feijoa, I think some guava, but avocado as well. And he was one of the first ones going to Judge Ord's trees and documenting them through this photograph and promoting them throughout Southern California. So what this sort of means for California, like the activity here, was that in late 1800s, you had a lot of seed being brought in from Mexico, from Guatemala, from wherever people could find it, and being planted in backyards or people's farms. But in the early 20th century, around 1911, there was the first dedicated attempt to go into Mexico or Guatemala or wherever and bring material back. And this was Wilson Popenoe and Carl Schmidt. They brought material back from Mexico, some of which you can still find at your local nursery. The variety Fuerte, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But also there's other expeditions. E.E. Knight in 1914 went down, and I think it's Queen that he brought back along with other ones. And then again, Popenoe went down in 1919 to Guatemala on a USDA-funded trip and brought back material from Guatemala, which again, some of which we still have in our collection. But there's a lot of this going on. Like I found that there was a report of somebody that brought material from Hawaii, maybe from the Philippines. So throughout this period, there's material coming in, but also now that the trees are starting to be adapted to the climate, California trees are also generating their own seeds. So we're beginning to create more varieties here in California, not just bringing them in. So a big switch at this point, or a big, great invention or transition with avocado is the advent of grafting. Now, grafting is a very old technique. It's where you can clonally propagate a tree or a grapevine or things like that, woody material, so that you keep the same tree over and over and over again. The issue with a lot of trees and fruit trees is that the seed is not the same as the parent, so you can't just plant seeds and have the exact same variety. So you want to clone it. And grafting is generally how people do that. So you'll take a piece of wood from one tree and you'll attach it to another, and then this will grow into the new tree, and you have a clone of where it was taken from. So with California and also Florida, and just in general, avocado is a very recently grafted tree. It's only since about the early 1900s that people began to successfully graft this tree. So 1905 was actually C.P. Taft in Orange, California. That is, from what we can tell, the earliest grafting that was successful here in California. But within a very short period of time, people were already grafting and generating their own commercial grows. And that Fuerte material from at least from Mexico that Wilson Pocono brought up, and from Guatemala, that was all grafted material. So these are the sort of first clones. But these first clones were brought into California from Mexico, from Guatemala. But now as things go forward, people are able to clone their own trees as well. So how does grafting work exactly? Well, basically, even in the 1940s, there was not a lot of consensus on how it could be done. These images here show an example of how citrus is grafted. It's a shield graft. And this is not something that we commonly do in avocado anymore. Avocado mainly now is a cleft graft or some whip grafts, depending on where you are. But basically, what the function of clonal propagation and grafting is, you want to have the same variety. So you have a consistent orchard. So your whole orchard is Hass, or your whole orchard is Fuerte, or whatever, what have you, or navel orange if you're doing citrus. So with avocado, though, modern situations as well, as we have this concept of clonal rootstocks. And I'm going to touch on this just to sort of go through it, to give you a general image of grafting. But you don't have to worry too much about clonal rootstocks, because this is more for commercial practices. Nowadays in California, most commercial growers have a clonal rootstock. So instead of just planting a seed and then grafting onto the seed, there's this extra process so that you have not only a clonal top of the tree, but a clonal bottom. And I'll demonstrate that in the next couple slides here. So the old sort of way of doing it is you plant seeds like this. You can see in here, you have a bunch of seeds in these styrofoam cups, and then you have someone get a little twig from another tree and they graft it onto that. And if we were just doing the old style of grafting that they did back in the 1900s, early 1900s, this is how they generated new trees. The second process is, if you wanted to graft it again, you would take these grafted seedlings and put them in the darkness and then etiolate. Just like when you put a potato under your cabinet, you forget about it, you get all these long shoots coming up as they look for light. The same is true of these avocado grafts. They put out a shoot that grows long and narrow looking for light, and that gives them more material to work with, because what they'll do is they'll take this little piece of trunk or stem here, and they'll apply rooting hormone, and then they'll pack it with soil, and then that top part now, which is grafted onto the seed, generates its own roots and grows into a tree that you can graft on top of. So the main thing to worry about or to understand is that avocados are clonally propagated like a lot of fruit trees, and that you need to graft them to have the same consistent fruit quality, but that you can also clone the bottom to have a similar consistent resistance to disease or drought tolerance or salt tolerance or whatever. So with that invention of grafting, there was an explosion of new varieties, because basically any person in California that planted their own seed and they liked the fruit, they could copy that over, they could clone it, graft it, and now they had a whole orchard of that variety. And this actually created a bit of a headache for for packing house and fruit handlers at the time, because there were so many different varieties that they didn't really, they couldn't handle them all the same. Avocados are very various. They're heterozygous, so they have a lot of different genetic parts to their chromosomes. But basically, the thing to remember is that they have very different seasons. So, we think of most of the time we go to the supermarket, we only see Hass, which is 95% of the global market. However, there are many other varieties, and Hass is generally a spring fruit, maybe into summer, depending on your climate. But there's winter varieties, there's fall varieties, there's summer varieties, lots of different seasons. So this was an issue for packing houses when all of these different fruits with different seasons were coming in. They weren't sure when they were ready and when they were not ready. But at the same time that you're getting this explosion in varieties, you're starting to see some new, really elite varieties begin to be come to the forefront. So obviously Hass, which was the first patented variety, and Fuerte, which we mentioned earlier and we'll discuss in a little bit, was also another one. So these began to take over some of the market share, but it still was nothing like what you see now, where 95% of the market is one variety. At the most at this point, maybe 25% would be Fuerte or something. And also at this particular point, they've been grafting long enough and often enough that they're beginning to see what they call strains or somoclonal variants of these varieties they graft. So what basically happens is that as you graft and clone something, it's genetically identical to where you got the grafting material from. But very rarely you'll get a mutation in that material, so that if you take a branch off of one tree and that particular branch has had a mutation and you graft it into a new tree, that new tree will have different genetic tendencies and slightly different genetics. And this is how strains have evolved per se. I mean, probably the one that most people are familiar with is a navel orange. There are many different kinds of navel orange now, such as Cara, which is red, and others. So these are these sort of slow mutations that can occur in a clonal line. People began to see these in Fuerte. Nowadays, that Hass is the major market, we're beginning to see these in Hass as well. So this legacy of sort of California's early germplasm, it's still alive and often in some ways undiscovered. These are some trees and fruit. My boss was actually up in Oakland, and there was somebody that had a backyard tree that was maybe 2 to 3 feet in diameter, very large, very old tree. We do not know what variety it was. It's probably totally unique. I went out a while ago out to Santa Monica, and I came across this tree. This gentleman had called me and emailed me and told me about it. We went out and collected some material, measurements, and this is a unique tree from what we can tell, probably planted in the 1930s. And there are still trees out there like this old or older perhaps, and they all represent a unique genetic legacy of California germplasm from this time. So in 1936, Wilson Pocono, though, was talking about the early avocado industry and propagation in nurseries. He was asked to sort of consolidate what the previous 20 years showed him. And one of the things he said, which is really interesting, and I'm hoping that you can see this with the window. I'm not sure how it looks in your Zoom, but I'll read it to you. And what he said was, when all is said and done, California hasn't had very many really good avocados, which haven't come directly or indirectly from Jalisco. That is an interesting fact to ponder over. So although everybody was grafting and planting new seeds and trying new material, there were still a lot of material that was not much better or any better or even perhaps worse than what they had originally collected in Mexico and in Guatemala, but specifically at Jalisco, Mexico, was a big source of California's germplasm. So when I talk about Jalisco and the material that Pocono brought up, the most famous is the Fuerte. The Fuerte avocado is still one that you can find in nurseries. You can probably find it in farmers markets as well for sale. It was the major commercial variety from about the 1920s to the 1970s. And this is a picture here. This is Alejandro LeBlanc. And the tree in his courtyard, in 1911, when they went down and brought this material up, this tree was probably already 50 to 60 years old. So when you see a fuerte tree in a nursery or you see fuerte fruit, you realize that this is genetic material that started in Mexico, perhaps sometime after the American Civil War. So it's a very old tree. But the reason they were interested in it and the reason it did so well is that it was adapted to a wide variety of climates. Again, the California growers are interested in Mexican and Guatemalan material. They thought it would do better in a colder Mediterranean climate, and fuerte did do that. It has a very good fruit quality as well. It's more of a winter spring fruit. It's a green skin fruit, which this is an interesting thing about the industry. The early industry thought that avocados had to be green skinned. They knew that the Mexican varieties would turn a darker color and that there were other colorations, but their expectation and their desire was for green-skinned avocados. And so the fuerte was the preeminent green-skinned avocado. The issues that they noticed with it, however, were that it's a large spreading tree, which means it takes a lot of space, potentially not being very efficient at acre and fruit ratios. And also, avocados have this tendency to alternate bear, which means they have a heavy year and a light year crop. So fuerte does tend to do this. My parents actually have a fuerte tree at their house, and there'll be a year where there's lots of fruit, followed by a year with not so much fruit. And this was something that people noticed, and they were trying to cross fuerte to breed it with other varieties to make a more consistent yield. And it is something that today we still strive to do, because avocados tend to alternate bear, some worse than others. So our goal is to try to guarantee every year having a consistent crop. But fuerte, for its time, was a really good tree. And in fact, the fruit is delicious. It's one of my favorites when it's ready. So after the fuerte, sort of the next historic variety of great importance is the Hass. Now, whereas the fuerte was material brought up from Mexico, the Hass was actually something, it's a California variety that was discovered in California, from a seed planted in California. We're not really clear on the parentage of a Hass. It's thought to be a seed from a variety called Lion, but the genetic information that's available for avocado is still very new. And we've only had avocado genome for about 2 years now. And so people are just beginning to look at this, but we don't exactly know the parentage of this variety. The story was that Rudolf Hass was a postmaster, and he planted avocados at his property as a sort of hobby. He was a grafter. And he had this seed he planted, and he could not graft to it. It didn't take grafts. And instead of cutting it down and planting a different seed to graft onto, his children actually recommended to him that this was a very good tasting fruit, that he should keep it. And so actually he followed up on that and he patented it. And this is the first avocado patent, is the Hass, which was patented in 1935. People were interested in it. It was less alternate bearing than fuerte. It was a smaller tree than fuerte, which are both traits that people were really interested in. However, at this particular point in time, I mentioned this before, people thought that avocados had to be green-skinned, and the Hass was a black-skinned fruit. And so what they said was its single disadvantage is its black color, which has been associated in the minds of the public with poor quality fruits. The assumption was that people would see a black fruit, they would think it was rotten. So people really liked the Hass, but they were attached to the fuerte and attached to greenskin. So they did not really follow up on it. It did not overtake the fuerte as a major commercial variety for some 50 years or so, until the 1970s. So that's just a little bit of history there. So at this time as well, these are two varieties that were developed that came about in the 1930s and 1940s, the Zutano and the Bacon. And the reason I have these two together on this slide is because they're currently commonly used pollinizer varieties. So I'm going to get into that in a little bit, but basically there's two flower types in avocado, and people now commonly use these, Bacon and Zutano, which are bee flower types, to pollinize an A flower type, which is Hass, for example, or Gem, or some other popular varieties. So these varieties, if you were to grow them yourself in your backyard, they're generally not as good in eating quality as Hass, for example, or Fuerte, but they have a lot of cold tolerance, so they do pretty well up in the Central Valley. They have an upright tree structure, so there's some interest in their architecture and their ability to fit a lot of them per acre. But mainly in current context, they're used to pollinize another flower type. So how does avocado flowering work? Now, most plants have both male and female flower parts. So basically they can give off pollen, or they can receive pollen to make a seed or fruit. Avocados are the same, but they have a physiological mechanism that helps to prevent them from pollinizing themselves. So a flower does not accidentally generate pollen that fuses with its own ovary to create a seed. Avocados are not as resistant to inbreeding as some plants, and so this is something they try to avoid. So the way they do that is by, they call synchronous dichotomy. So what it is each flower opens twice. It opens first as female, and then it closes for a period of time, and then opens again as male. So that way, the idea is that the flower cannot pollinize itself. So how does this work exactly? Well, this is actually an illustration from Norm Elstrand's Sex in the Kitchen Table book. And I like this a lot because it really shows that the issue of A and B flower type, these two different flowering types, is not so much timing, but a sort of duration of timing. So as you can see in the picture here at the top, the A flower type, which is flower types such as Hass avocado, Gwen avocado, Lamb Hass, I'll get into these other varieties later. Most of the common production avocados are A flower types. But you can see that it opens in the morning as a female, and then closes, and then the next day it opens in the afternoon as a male. Contrast that to a B flower type, such as the Zutano or the Bacon I was talking about, or the Fuerte, as well as a B flower type. And this is a variety or a flowering type that opens as female in the afternoon, and then it closes at night, and the very next day in the morning opens as male. So the idea is you plant a mixture of these in your field for commercial purposes, and the male stage will be open in the morning when the A flower type or your main crop is female, and it receives the pollen and increases your yield. This is a standard way of doing things. For a backyard grower, this will increase fruit set if you have a mix of A and Bs. But I generally, if I was to give advice to a backyard grower and you only have room for one particular tree, it's fine. They will set fruit on their own because it's not a perfect system. As you can see in this picture, there is at the top a female flower open, and here is a male flower. Not completely open. These little anthers, when they're really ready to go, they'll open up and release the pollen from these valves. But it's possible on a tree that you could have a couple hours of overlap, even with this AB flower type system. So the way that this, the avocado itself flowers is that it has all of these like millions, literally millions of very small, generally nondescript flowers that bloom, and the whole tree kind of acts like a bouquet to attract pollinizers. And there's a very low percentage of these flowers that actually come to be fruit, so that you could have millions of flowers on a generally like a 5 to 10 year old Hass tree, for example, millions of flowers, and if you're lucky, those will result in several hundred fruit. So it's a very inefficient system. And then also, as you'll find, the initial fruit set that you get from your flowers, these tiny little seeds, the fruits, they'll grow and grow, and then you'll have a series of drops throughout the year. Some of them might not have been viable to begin with, but when you have an environmental condition such as a Santa Ana or the first hot spell of the year, you further lose more of these little fruitlets. So the whole process is very inefficient. And actually, it's something that for us as breeders is a problem, because if you're working with an apple tree or other varieties, you can take the pollen from one flower and transfer it to another, and then bag that off and label it. And you know that this fruit, this seed, has the pollen from this other one. If your percentage is really low of actual successful fruit coming out of this, it becomes very costly to do that. And actually, I think in the 1960s or 50s, somebody did a hand pollinization experiment when they hand crossed 10,000 flowers. And out of those 10,000 flowers, there was 20 something fruit that resulted. And then of those fruit, only 4 actually came all the way to generate a viable seed. So it's a very low percentage. When it comes to avocado flowering, it prevents us from successful breeding in some cases. So it's a challenge. So another variety from this period is the reed. This is a mid-century avocado variety. It's a California avocado variety. It's a large green fruit. It's a more Guatemalan type tree. And this variety never picked up to quite the same scale of success in the industry that, say, Hass did, obviously, or Fuerte. But although it's a green skin fruit, which in today's market is not so desirable, and it's a large fruit, it has a nice small tree shape. So growers like it because you can fit more per acre. And there's recently been some development of a market for it as a sort of elite or niche high-end fruit. So my understanding is actually they can get a pretty good price for this variety in some fields, and it sells well in Whole Foods and farmers markets. It's a very good tasting fruit. Reed is actually, in the summertime, it's an amazing fruit. My boss refers to it as the Cadillac of avocados. It's a very good fruit, and it's a consistent producer. But this was discovered in Carlsbad from seedling, thought to be from Nabal, which is one of those Guatemalan introductions from about 1914. So even though this reed tree here is patented in 1960, so it's well after the halfway point of the 20th century, it still has roots that go back to Guatemala, just one generation to the early 20th century or before. So another variety as well from this period is Pinkerton. And Pinkerton's had a little brief success. I've seen this variety when I first started working 20 years ago. I saw this variety once or twice in the supermarket. Now you see it more often at farmers markets. It's a very good fruit. It's a green skin fruit, has a sort of pebbly, you can see in this picture, like a Hass, has that pebbly sort of skin. It's thought to have been a cross from Hass and Rincon in this grove in Satacoy. But one of the issues with this variety that perhaps it didn't pick up so much is it takes a long time to ripen. So it's got a very good shelf life. But whereas with the Hass fruit, when you go to the supermarket, they have this Ripe Tonight program where the idea is, if you get the fruit and take it home, it should be ready in a day or two. With Pinkerton, I've picked them before, and it's taken 2 weeks or so for them to get soft. It's a good tasting fruit. It's great to eat, but it just takes a lot of patience. But the thing about Pinkerton that sort of transitions to what I'm talking about next is that this is from a book advising avocado growers and what varieties they can choose, 1983. And the author, Mr. Koch, says that as far as like how Pinkerton came about, it appears that sloppy farm management produced the seedling. One might suspect that nearly all varieties have come to us by loose farm operations. And this is true about everything that I've been talking about so far. They have been the result of somebody planting a seed either intentionally or by accident and discovering that it's a good variety. They have not been the result of an intentional search for new varieties. And that is where our program at UCR comes in. So there's a split screen here. There's two sort of parts of the UCR program. I'm going to talk about the scions, which is on the, I guess, the left side of your screen over here, with Dr. Berg and his UCR program. So this is the part that develops the fruit qualities of the tree. The other part of the program that was through plant pathology at UCR, and it's a very vigorous program. You brought a lot of material in from Central America and developed it here as well, is Dr. Zentmeyer and the rootstock program. And they were looking at disease resistance in avocado rootstocks. So these two programs work together in different departments. You know, when Dr. Berg would generate a good fruit variety, they try it out on Dr. Zentmeyer's rootstocks. We still do the same thing. With our fruit varieties, we work with Dr. Patty Montesalvo over in the rootstock side, and once she has some material and we have some material, we'll often plan out a field with a mix of different rootstocks and a mix of different varieties, because actually there is some effect. Some combinations of rootstock and scion, some graft combinations work much better than others. But I'm going to focus on the scions that UC Riverside has been developing from Dr. Berg forward. So we talked about earlier some of the challenges specific to avocado. There we go. Similar to avocado breeding. And we talked about the flowering issues, how that made hand crossing difficult or impossible. It's also a very low percentage of success. We'll plant out thousands of seeds in a year, and really only 1 to 2% of those are worth carrying forward. Another issue with avocado fruit breeding as well is you need to ripen the fruit. If we were peach breeders, we could just go out to the field, cut a fruit from the tree, taste it, and we'd know right away if it was good to eat or not. We could flag the tree to remove or keep. With avocado, you have to ripen it, so you have to take it back to the lab. Then you make the evaluation. So that's an extra step. Another thing about avocado is, like I said, it's a newly domesticated crop, so it has a lot of plasticity. We say high G by E, which basically means it has a lot of environmental effects on it. So, you know, the genetics of the tree are not the only thing that matters. You know, there's environment, nature and nurture. Avocado is very sensitive to nurture, to the environment. So what I find in a tree or a fruit from the Central Valley, same exact genetics in Southern California behaves quite differently. And that's a challenge for us to overcome. And in general, with tree crops, the challenges are it's a long-term time commitment, takes a long time to develop a variety, and it's expensive as far as land, water, and other resources go. So this is just an example of how Dr. Berg and some of these early innovators overcame some of these challenges. You know, one of the ideas he had about difficulties of pollinizing or hand pollinizing is perhaps letting bees work by putting a box around the tree or a net and then letting the bees do the work. And he had actually quite a bit of success at intentionally crossing varieties or selfing varieties or just crossing themselves through these techniques. But currently the best technique or the most successful technique that we engage in our program, and it's kind of relevant, I'm talking to you on Zoom here right now because of the COVID-19 or whatever, is basically we social distance the trees from each other. So as you can see in this particular slide, down here at the bottom, there's a line of trees, and they are at least a quarter mile from any other avocado trees, which is up at the top of the screen there. The idea is that bees will not generally transfer the pollen that far. It's not a perfect system, but it works pretty well. Just like socially isolating, we socially isolate the trees to keep the pollen within group so we can sort of intentionally cross them that way. So, the timeline of the program, Dr. Berg took over in the 1950s, UCR. And actually the program was at UCLA before that, but moved to UC Riverside. His first really big successful release, well, I'll talk about in a bit, there was 3 varieties, but Gwen was the most important. And then the next sort of wave after the release of Gwen was he planted a lot of different seedlings all up and down the state. So there was acreage at South Coast Research Extension Center, but there was also acreage on private property in Fallbrook, in Ventura County. Wherever he could get a farmer or a grower to give him an acre or two, he planted seeds out. And from that cohort, basically, the next series of UC releases came out. So Lamb, Hass, and Surprise, which I'll talk about. And then where I came in, I started working about 1999, 2000 with Dr. Arpaia. At that time, she was reorganizing the project. Dr. Berg had retired quite a while before. And the next set of releases were material from Dr. Berg, The Gem and the Harvest in 2003. But we continued to plant out seeds and seedling trees and evaluate them to try to generate the next wave after that. And I'll briefly get into that at the very end. I have a picture of some fruit you can see. But this is an ongoing process, and it takes a long time. Like I said, it's a time commitment. The material that we are currently thinking we could release was from seed that was planted over 20 years ago. About 20 years. If you're in a real hurry, maybe you could get a variety from seed to patent and release in like 15 years. But it's a lot of evaluations you have to do. It's just a very time-consuming process. You plant the seed, and it takes 5 to 6 years before the fruit is being born on that seedling tree. So the first successful, majorly successful release from Dr. Berg's program was the Gwen. And the Gwen is a variety that you still see, everybody sees it in farmers markets. We have some in our collection. It's a good tree. It's a good fruit. I've seen it in nurseries. It's basically, for all intents and purposes, a green-skinned Hass, because this was what the industry was asking Dr. Berg to produce. And this is another downfall or issue with the time that it takes to produce a tree from a seed to a patented variety, is that in the 1960s, 1970s, when he was planting the seeds for the Gwen, he was asked for a green-skinned Hass, and he spent much of his career working towards creating a green-skinned Hass, and he did, and he called it the Gwen. However, by the time he was successful in the 1980s, Hass had already taken over from Fuerte as the major commercial variety. So you can see in 1945, the issue that Griswold said in his article on the Hass was, its big disadvantage is its black color. Nobody wants that. Here we are, 40 years later, we have this green-skinned Hass, but at this point, it's a drawback because Hass is the major market, and now people want black skin. So he spent 20 years or so generating green-skinned Hass. It just goes to show that sometimes you have to keep an open mind about where the future is going to take you. Now, despite the lack of interest in the Gwen, once it was developed due to the Hass being the preeminent variety, he didn't lose any hope. I mean, you just have to keep going forward as a breeding program. And that's like when I said he planted 50 to so thousand seedlings out throughout the state. And these resulted in the next several releases of UC varieties. One of these is the Surprise. This was a 1996 release. This is a bee flower type, actually. So this is something that as a breeding program we take interest in, is we know that maybe a flower type, such as Hass, is the major market, the major crop. Well, if you can generate a bee flower type that has a good fruit quality, better than the Zutano, better than the Bacon, then there's a real market for that, a real interest in that. Because as it currently is, a farmer is planting out mostly Hass with just enough pollinizers to give them increased productivity, but he doesn't get much value from the pollinizer's fruit because it's not a high quality. So with the Surprise, this was one of the first sort of bee flower types we generated that had this potential to maybe be a pollinizer for Hass or another A flower type. And it's a very good tasting fruit, has a very small seed. And another thing about a lot of varieties that we have in our program is that when you make guacamole with this or cut slices, it doesn't turn brown as quickly as Hass. So Surprise is a very good fruit. But the issue we found with this is that it alternate bears very heavily. And so interest kind of fell off on this because sometimes you'll have 2 years of hardly any crops, and then you'll get a bumper crop. So it's a very erratic bearer. And there was also some concern Initially, the breeders thought they saw this fruit. It looks like a Mexican-style fruit, smooth skin, black skin. It should be cold tolerant. They planted a lot of it in the San Joaquin Valley. It's not that cold tolerant. So although this is a real high-quality premium fruit, it did not quite take off at the level that the Lambhass did, which was released the same year. So the Lambhass was also patented in 1996, just like the Surprise, but it's a different fruit. It's more Hass-like. And you can see in the picture it's larger than Hass. It has a distinctive sort of ridge or shoulder at the top, but it's a black skin fruit like the Hass. And it's a nice, small, narrow tree, which is good. But the other thing is that it's a summer fruit. So this is a variety that would not compete with the Hass market, but would complement it. So your Hass basically is a spring fruit, and then Lambhass, usually we think of that as coming into July, August maybe, and that's when the fruit's good. And so it's not competing with Hass. If a farmer was going to plant Hass and Lambhass, potentially he could have a longer season, harvest the Hass earlier, and then when the Hass is done, he could harvest the Lambhass. So this is kind of the value of Lambhass. And there's been some interest in this. Previously, there was a lot of acreage being planted up in Ventura and Santa Barbara counties, mainly Ventura County. And again, recently there's been more acreage of Lambhass. They actually got a very good price for this variety last year, I think, because the Hass harvest was very slow. So once that season was over, Lambhass was there, and they got a very good price for it. So it's, as I said, it's a more upright tree. So another thing about this is farmers can plant more of these per acre. So even if the tree is slightly smaller, you have more per acre, you can get more fruit per acre, and it's a more efficient system. So the sort of next release of this same cohort. So these are all Dr. Berg, and then Gray Martin was the breeder in the 1980s. These are all selections they made. So in 1996, we released Lambhass and Surprise. And then in 2003, after Dr. Arpaia had taken over the program again and sort of reorganized it, the next two varieties released were these two, which I'm going to talk about here. The first is Harvest. Now, Harvest is these are both Hass-like fruit. So they have like a dark colored mature fruit, like a Hass. But this is a later fruit. This is more of a summer to fall fruit. It is sort of rounder than Hass. It's a large oval fruit. And the trees tend to have a pretty good consistent yield on them. One of the issues with it, though, is that the canopy is large, so you can't plant as many of these per acre necessarily. And also, we noticed that, and you can see in the picture here, it's sort of an open canopy. One of the things you want with a avocado tree is you want to make sure the leaves cover the fruit so that they have shading from the sun. When you have an open canopy like this, you can run into issues of sunburning. And so that is one of the problems with Harvest. The other issue was that it tends to be cold sensitive. However, it did very well, as I recall. They had some tests in Coachella Valley. It takes heat very well. So this is the Harvest. The other one that was released in the same year is a much more famous fruit known as the Gem. So the Gem now, this is one that's really taking off, actually. Perhaps you've heard of it. There's a backlog of trees and nurseries. Like nurseries they have a waiting list, as it were. And people are planting a lot of acres of this fruit. And I think last year was the first time that I heard someone say that this variety, they saw it in the store, which is great because I've worked for Dr. Arpaia 20 years, and when I first started working, I saw Fuerte in the stores sometimes. I've seen Lambhass in the stores twice in that 20 years, Pinkerton once. So it would really be awesome to see Gem in the store. And I heard that at a Gilson's, I think in Orange County, somebody saw this last year, and they actually have an SKU code for it. So this is one the industry is finally beginning to push. It has already picked up internationally. Actually, there's a lot of interest in this from South African growers and in the European Union markets. But Why are we interested in this variety? Well, as you can see, it's very Hass-like in its appearance. It's a somewhat sort of rounder, more oval-shaped fruit or teardrop-shaped fruit. And the season overlaps with Hass. So we think about this, whereas the lamb Hass is not a substitute for Hass, it's later than Hass. Gem could substitute Hass. It's a little bit later, I'd say probably like 3 weeks or so, but it depends on your environment. But a little bit later than Hass, maybe a month later, 3 weeks later. But there's an overlap. So a grower could think about replacing Hass with Gem if that made sense for them. Why might that make sense? Well, it is a smaller tree. This is actually one that you could plant more per acre, like the lamb Hass. And another thing as well is, again, it has fruit that's borne on the inside of the canopy, protected from the sun, well shaded. But also, we've begun sort of looking into planting this in some more extreme environments. And actually, one of our most sort of remote field sites is in the Central Valley, on the way to the sequoias. And up in that area, Gem seems to do pretty well. Sometimes in those extreme climates, we found that at that field site, our Hass fruit size was not very good. We got a lot of smaller fruit, whereas Gem kept its size much better. So, that's another thing. Like I said, the environmental effects are very strong. So you never know, like, what's going to do well in a different place until you try it out. But Gem seems to be well adapted, not just to heat, but also to cold. And it is a more compact tree. And you can see here, this is sort of a cluster of fruit on the inside. So basically, like, we've lifted that up and you're looking from inside the tree out. But when you look at the outside of the tree, it's well protected. You don't see fruit out there. So just a sort of overview of the commonly available or well-known California avocado varieties. You can see them here. We have the bacon and the zutano, the pollinizer, the bee flower types, along with the fuerte, which is also bee flower type, that early commercial fruit. Then the Hass here, and the Pinkerton and the Reed, and then these UC varieties, Gem and lamb Hass. We don't have the surprise on this particular slide, but you've already seen that. And so this is an ongoing process. Those are all varieties that you can find at nurseries or in the store or farmers markets. But we also have a lot of new varieties we're looking at. And matter of fact, actually, like, we've recently received funding for a 3-year program, and it looks like we're finally going to be able to release another 4 or 5 varieties in the next couple of years. And there are four of these varieties I'm showing you right here. You can see these fruits, UCR 2, 3, 4, and 1, as compared to Hass. This gives you an idea of their seasonality, although it's still preliminary. And actually, one of the things we found about this UCR 1 fruit is, maybe we can actually pick this one earlier. But again, what you need to do is plan out a lot of different regional trials, and you see how the fruit performs in different locations. But this is just to say that going forward, there's a lot of varieties that we're still developing, and there's always room to improve. So we talked about how the fuerte was highly alternate bearing, but it was a good fruit. And then the Hass came along, and even though it was black skin, they didn't like that at that time, it was not as alternate bearing. It was a smaller tree, and that was good. So from that, we had lamb Hass and Gem, which are smaller trees. Gem is less alternate bearing. So it's like there's always room to sort of gradually improve the traits in avocados. And since it's a recent domesticate as well, there's a lot of room for improvement in efficiency of canopy and water use efficiency, a lot of other things. So, and then I'm talking about in an agricultural system, in the modern agricultural system, you have what they call a monoculture, which is a lot of the same clonal crops planted out acre by acre by acre. So there's not a lot of genetic diversity in those farmers' fields necessarily. So part of what we as plant breeders need to do is we have to think in terms of the long term of generating that diversity, because you never know what's going to happen. It could be climate change or some kind of issue with changing weather, where all of a sudden it's too hot for them to flower, And if you only have one type of avocado, it doesn't have the genetic diversity to respond to that. But maybe we have something in our collection and our program that will work in that situation. Same thing with disease issues. There's, I don't know if you guys are aware of the Cavendish banana. There's this tropical disease. It's a fungal disease, I think, that's moving through bananas. And bananas are all Cavendish are all one sort of clonal type. And so when you have just one type of genetic crop, then you are very susceptible to getting taken out by a disease or a change in climate. And so that's what the breeder must always be thinking of. And also, I would say that's what hobbyists and backyard growers, such as master gardeners, California red fruit growers, or even just people like you, if you're seeing this and you're thinking about, getting your own avocado tree, try planting seed. That's how new stuff's found, and with that said, we're talking about the UCR holdings. People have asked me actually this last weekend. My friend Gabe and his girlfriend, I saw them at the store, and I told him about this project I was doing in this presentation. He asked how many varieties of avocados are there. That's a very difficult question to say or to answer. I know from our personal collection, we have around 250 different varieties per se. And then the rootstock program probably has another several hundred. Basically, anytime you plant a new seed, it could be a new variety of avocado, but there's just at least thousands of potential varieties in different regions throughout the world. And it's always good to keep an eye on that diversity. So here at UCR, actually at South Coast Research Extension Center, where most of our fields are located, we have around 250 Persei Americana avocado selections. And we also have other related species. And actually, that's what these pictures are here. There's some of these sort of avocado-like or relatives that have these, they're almost like little olives or blueberry-looking fruit. Very different. But in some cases, they collected these 50 to 60 years ago. We don't even know if they still exist in Veracruz or in Guatemala or in Costa Rica where they got them. But there's a lot of diversity out there that's unexplored. And so with that, my acknowledgments, a lot of my images I got from California Avocado Society yearbooks. You can find a lot of those on this web link, avocadosource.com. There's a lot of PDFs of scans and stuff on there, papers and images. At UCR, the Department of Botany and Plant Sciences, that's my department for 20 years. It's a great department, great colleagues. And I thank Graduate Division. They've been very supportive of me in my move towards getting my PhD. Thanks for UCANR and South Coast for having me here. And as always, thank California Red Fruit Growers and UC Master Gardeners. Had a lot of help maintaining our fields from those guys, or bringing varieties to my attention, or propagating material. With that, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to talking to you and seeing you guys on the Q&A session on Saturday. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric.
All right. Thanks so much. That was a great video there, Eric. If you guys got any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
There's a question on the chat from Vu. So can you comment on the JB Avo variety?
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to unmute myself. I saw that. Yeah, JB, Jan Boyce, that is a good variety. It tastes very nice. Small green skin fruit. I know a lot of people, the Orange County California red fruit growers, a lot of them have that variety and they like it a lot. It tends to have a short season. I think it's probably, I don't know how it is in Riverside, but out there it's maybe an April, May or a May, June fruit. so it doesn't have a very long season. It also tends to be a sort of fairly large spreading upright tree, so it does take up some space, but it's a very high quality fruit. Doesn't peel super easily. That's one of the things I always look for in our new selections is I try to have fruit that peels easily. Jan Boyce is not the greatest peeler, but it's a really good tasting fruit. Green skin.
This is Christine. I have a question. You said you're in Temecula and that you were going to grow rootstock using Mexicola seedlings. And
that was Greg Rager.
Oh, I'm sorry. I got that mixed up.
But go ahead. You have a question.
Okay. I watched the other video too, so sorry. Well, I've just bought some property over in Homeland, which is near Hemet.
Okay.
And so I'm moving from Riverside, which is zone 18 Sunset, to zone 19. So I have to kind of learn to work with that. But I'm planning, I have a big fence, so I'm planning to plant the avocados next to the fence for a windbreak. It's like an 8-foot tall fence. Okay. But any particular varieties you think I should work on?
Yeah, I don't know anybody that's growing them out there right now. I mean, Greg is doing what he does in Temecula. I mean, if you're looking for sort of more cold tolerant varieties, Fuerte is more cold tolerant than Hass. Stewart is another sort of Mexican style variety that is pretty cold tolerant. I have that in my backyard here in Reno Valley. And I mean, even it's just a matter of degrees. I mean, if you can set it up in the right location and get it through those first few years, you could, maybe Hass would even do well there. It just sort of depends. I have noticed that Gem, which is the new release, seems to be a little more tolerant of heat and cold than Hass does. I don't know that I'd say we have strong data on that, but I've anecdotally noticed it does well in the Central Valley where you get a lot of hot and cold. So Gem might actually be one you might be interested in trying. But I would just say, I guess, play around, I know that I think Reed is more sensitive than Hass generally. And Lamb Hass also, I think, is a little more cold sensitive than Hass from what I've seen. So
I like Reed. Good.
Well, I'm saying I've heard it's a little cold sensitive.
Okay.
But it's a small tree. Maybe you can build a shelter around it if you need to.
I have one here. I know, so I know I like the fruit. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Charlotte posted, what can you recommend for Riverside varieties, cold resistant, and what seeds should we plant for rootstock?
Okay. Well, like I said about the cold resistant varieties I mentioned already. I mean, the most cold tolerant varieties generally are like Bacon and Zutano. So that's like the extremes, But I think in Riverside you don't need to go that far. So Fuerte is a good variety. It's cold tolerant. Does well in my parents' house. Like I said, Stewart tends to do pretty well. That's another good Mexican style fruit. So Gem does better than Hass. There's a variety that it's called Mexicola, and that's the one that Greg actually talks about using for seed. That's an interesting variety. It's a very small fruit, very early season actually in South Coast. Those, I mean, I guess I could probably, sometimes they're ready in August from the fruit that flowered the same year. That's an interesting fruit because it's a very Mexican style fruit. You actually eat the skin on it. And that's fairly cold tolerant as well. So I see this question about a dwarf avocado that can be grown in a very small space. So, one of the things that I get asked a lot is about growing avocados in pots. I recommend against that. So we'll just say that. I don't recommend growing them in pots. They don't like it. That said, there are some varieties that are smaller than others. My neighbors are shooting out fireworks. There's some varieties that are smaller than others. One of the ones that we released back, I think it was around 2000. It was sort of a test run, and I didn't mention this in my presentation, but it's called the Holiday, and you'll see that. I think Oliver Atkins Nursery propagates that for sale. But Holiday is a small tree, and there was a lot of interest in it early on from backyard growers because it generates this sort of small mounding leafy tree that you could sort of stake it up to get the trunk a little bit higher, as high as you need. It would sort of form this mounding canopy. So that's a small variety. It's a Guatemalan type. It's actually the daughter of Murrieta Green, which is that Juan Murrieta, one of his selections. So that's a small green skin fruit, late season, probably a summer fall fruit. That's probably one of the smallest trees that I'm familiar with. I know there's the Wurtzer Little Cotto, which is also a small tree. We have that in our collection, but I haven't heard much impressive discussion of the flavors. So I've never really tried it. Reed is a smaller tree than Hass. It's an upright tree. I mean, that's something to think about too. I think Lamb Hass is more upright than Hass, and you could perhaps prune it to keep it short. But Reed, there's some growers in the Temecula area and the Fallbrook area that actually they commercially grow Reed for the sort of niche market, and they're able to grow it at a high density because they can pack more per acre, and they keep them small so that you don't need a ladder to pick them. So Reed is a tree that actually handles being kept small fairly well.
There's a question here. Have an avocado tree where the fruit was huge but never ripened on or off the tree. What would cause this?
Yeah. Well, it depends on the variety, and that's actually something that I'm very interested in, this fruit ripening. My suspicion is that basically an avocado is a tropical or subtropical species. So in the tropics, they ripen no problem at all. But here in California, we're kind of at the edge of their range, the natural range. We're more of a Mediterranean climate. And so there are certain varieties, especially the West Indian varieties, that just don't mature properly here. So it's possible that some California seedlings or whatever might have some West Indian genetics in them, or just genetics that are like the West Indian genetics that don't allow them to mature properly under our climate. And I don't really know why that is. I have my suspicions about it. We actually have a variety, though, in our collection. It's not available to the general public. We just evaluated it for, to check it out. And it's a variety from South Africa. And the reason we're interested in that is because we were in South Africa in 2006. And this is in Irvine, it averages about 2 pounds. Yeah, 1 kilo is about 2 pounds. So it's a big fruit. And in South Africa, it's a big fruit as well. And one of the things we found in our collection was that in Southern California, sometimes big fruit doesn't ripen properly. It doesn't ripen evenly, at least. Like one part will ripen before the other. And so, that's kind of inconvenient. But this variety in South Africa, it was enormous. It's like a pound and a half, soft all the way through, tastes really good, nice and rich. So we tried it here in California, and we get big fruit, but it does not soften properly. It drops in the winter, and it's watery and stringy, and if you don't know what an avocado tastes like, I guess it's good enough, but I can't bring myself to eat them. So it's disappointing, But yeah, some varieties just don't ripen properly here. And that was a big issue, for people bringing material here from the tropics and subtropics, is finding the ones that do ripen properly here.
So I know the Reed's a fairly big fruit. Is that the Reed avocado?
Yes.
It's really big. Do they have that problem?
No, Reed. Well, see, Reed is the varieties that they brought back from Guatemala that we still have in our collection. There's two from that cohort. There's Nabal and there's Nimlio, and both of those ripen properly here in California. And that might be the reason that we still have those in our collections, whereas the other ones somehow made their way out long in the past. But they're from Guatemala. Guatemala is a very mountainous country, so actually there's some places there where they get frost. And so although we tend to think of Mexican avocados as being the most cold tolerant, there are Guatemalan varieties that handle cold okay. And the other thing is as well that the sort of the ripening style, I think, is different in Mexican versus Guatemalan. Basically Mexican fruit, they flower in the spring, and within a year, you're eating that fruit. It's ready to eat. In Guatemalan fruit, that's not the case, but what I found is that Guatemalan and hybrid fruit, say Mexican Guatemalan fruit, tends to have a stronger environmental effect, that G/E effect. So in the Central Valley, we'll pick Hass in November from the same year. And by January or February, if you don't pick it, it's on the ground, where the season's just starting down here. So things are sped up there. And so we have this variety that was discovered in Laguna Niguel. In Laguna Niguel, it's a Guatemalan type variety. It's a fall fruit. Just a couple miles inland in South Coast Research Extension Center, that is ready now. It's a summer fruit. In the Central Valley, I pick it in March. So there's a really strong environmental effect on I think, the Guatemalan type fruits. Whereas Mexican fruit is it's early, regardless of where it is. And then West Indians just don't seem to do well at all. So.
Hi, I had asked earlier, do you have any recommendations for rootstock if we have access to that?
You mean like for seedling rootstock or for clonal rootstock?
To graft onto.
You mean as a seedling or?
Right. If I was going to plant seeds of an avocado, is that for Mexicola or
okay. So
Chano?
Yeah, so I mean, Greg's recommendation, which I think makes sense, is that if you're getting seed from a Mexican tree, Mexican type tree, so like a Mexicola, a Zutano, something that's cold tolerant already, that the seeds should have some of those genetics in them. I mean, avocado seedlings aren't true to the parent in some ways, but some of those broad sort of traits, as far as like cold tolerance or salt tolerance, those seem to be heritable. So that's the basis for recommending a Mexican seed. You want something cold tolerant. So Greg recommended Mexicola. That's a cold tolerant tree. It's a Mexican style fruit. The issue with Mexicola is it's a small fruit and a small seed. So, I mean, for commercial growers, what they use is Zutano. A lot of it, I think, is the commercial grower is going to use whatever they have because it's available. And Zutano is a big seed. So that's something to consider as well. But, I would just say, even if you have to use Hass, it's better than nothing. But, you'd probably go for a Zutano seed, bacon seed, Mexicola if you can get it. But, I mean, those are pretty easy to find, I would imagine.
Great. Thank you very much. I'll throw this out to the group, too, that my neighbor across the street has lived there for better than 50 years, and she has Zutano and Mexicola. Those are the two trees. There was a big freeze back, I can't remember what year she said, but it killed all the avocados. But the Zutano and the Mexicola survived the freeze. And so I can ask her to save the seeds. I can make the seeds available to other members that are interested in grafting. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
Oh, tell them where you're located, Charlotte.
Okay, I'm in Riverside, in the Citrus District, in the Green Belt, Van Buren in the 91.
All right.
Well, your location, you know, how they do well in that location makes, you know, to know what will be similar.
True. Okay.
Great. Any more questions?
Well, thank you. Is it about? Nope.
All right. Well, Eric, thank you so much for your time. That was an awesome video, and thank you so much for all the answers there.
No problem. You're welcome, and thanks for having me. Perhaps we can talk in the future. I've mentioned in an email to Christine about if you guys need a speaker in the future. You know, I have some UCR students as well that work in citrus, and so. But no, this is great. I had a good time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
thanks.
Cool.
Definitely be in touch in the future.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Eric.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys. See you.
See you now. Great. We got a couple more people on that weren't on the beginning. So Christine's got a couple announcements, and she's going to talk about our upcoming speakers. So I'm going to just share the screen with her real quick. Give me 1 second. All right, Christine, you're in charge now, so you can share your screen.
Okay. So I was gonna. They're showing the Facebook page. So even if you're not a member of Facebook, you can always go to our Facebook page. You just won't be able to make comments on it. But you know, we're at Facebook at IE CRFG, IE for Inland Empire. And if you go to the events link, which is over here on the left, and so that's where I've been trying to keep up our events page. You can see there's tonight's meeting is there, but tomorrow the Friday demonstration orchard improvement. So you can click on there and get more details. And then I've got a few more the Saturday work days set up there, but Frank's planning to be out there every Saturday. So if anybody can't come on Saturday and would like a Sunday work day, you know, if they want to head up a work team, you know, you can contact me and we can set that up, you know, because we just have to check with Wes at the orchard to let him know a team's coming in and make sure they're open because they've been cutting their hours shorter. And then the next meeting, I've just been setting them up as online. If we finally decide we can meet in person, we'll change that. But you know, I have not yet found out if we confirmed for the August meeting. It's supposed to be with Giselle Schoeniger. When we originally contacted her, we were planning to have an in-person meeting. So I haven't heard back yet if she's comfortable with doing a Zoom meeting. So I still need to confirm that. And then I know, and she's going to speak on organic gardening. She's with Kellogg's Organics. She was a speaker at the Festival of Fruit last summer. And then the September is going to be on berries with Mike Horak. He's got his own orchard and vineyard in south of Lake Matthews in the Gavilan Hills area. He's also a master gardener. So he knows a lot about berries. He can speak on a lot of things, but you know, and I've got the link to his website there if you want to check him out more in advance. But I've toured his orchard and heard him speak to the master gardener, so he's a really good speaker. Yeah, I guess that's all I've got.
Thanks.
Lisa's not on tonight. So I don't know if we want to tell any visitors about how to join us if they're interested.
Yeah. If you're interested, you just put your contact, just shoot an email there into the chat box and we'll follow up with you. That'd probably be the easiest thing we can do at the moment. Question here from Patrick. If we're going to do a demonstration about how to graft avocados. Yeah. we can definitely have some demonstrations. We do have a grafting demonstrations that we put on. What time do we usually put that on, Christine or Nick?
When are we putting it on?
When do we usually start talking about grafting?
January meeting.
Well, back in the normal world, yeah, the January meeting is our scion exchange, and we do grafting demonstrations then. And then we had been talking about doing a spring scion exchange, in May or April, when we could bring, avocado and subtropical scions. But that's just this year. We were planning to do that, but this year is when COVID hit and it didn't get happened. So that didn't make good English, but.
Patrick, to your question, yeah. January probably a better time. And then, yeah, just keep asking the question next time around. Hopefully we'll have a better answer for you as far as grafting avocados particularly.
Maybe we can do that as, a Zoom presentation.
Yeah, we can. Great idea.
I know I have found several, you can find all kinds of stuff on YouTube, but I have found several grafting demonstrations for avocados, and I was also looking up loquats, how to graft. So there was a whole bunch of stuff there.
I just interject. I have actually 4 avocados I have to graft, so I can try to set it up for next meeting just to have a quick, just quick example of how I do it and just kind of show people. I'm not an expert in grafting by any sense, but I've done enough to kind of know the basics of it. So if we want to set that up, I can help. I can accommodate for that.
Yeah, do a little pre-show before our main speaker.
Sure.
Awesome, Nick. Appreciate that.
No worries.
Yeah, great. So,
are we going to post this meeting? And I didn't know if we got the last meeting posted.
I was recording this one, so we will post it, and I will get the other one up, last one up as well. So I'll get those up here real quick.
As soon as I find out, then I can get the link on the Facebook page.
Can do. All right. So yeah, just if those that don't know, we have that work meeting tomorrow. It's at the Rupert Mountain Discovery Center. It's over up to 60, where the metal dinosaurs are at. We have a couple of demonstration orchards there. So got some work tomorrow, put some mulch out to help suppress the weeds. But if you're interested in coming in and helping out, that'd be great. There's plenty of fruit to pick. And also it's just a great time to learn hands-on in the orchard.
If you just want to get out and see our orchard, if you haven't been out there, just be aware that the venue, the Rupert Mountains Discovery Center, is closed to the public right now because of COVID. We get let in right at 9 o'clock. So please let Frank know. His phone number is there on the Facebook event page. So he knows to expect you. And if you're running late for anything, call him or text or call me and make sure we know that so we can look out for you somehow.
Yeah, so we'll have to keep our distance. So bring some snacks, bring some water, and a hat. Yeah.
They require us there to wear masks, even if we're keeping far away from. But that's when we're spreading mulch. It's kind of a good idea anyway, so you don't get the dust in your lungs.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, anybody else have any questions or comments? Wrapping up here.
Thanks. That was great.
Appreciate it. Glad you can join us.
Well, thank you to all the visitors for joining in tonight.
Yeah, hopefully see you guys again next month. So we meet on the first Thursday at 7 o'clock. 7 p.m. first Thursday of the month. So it'll be the same Zoom link.
Great. Thanks.
Great. Have a great night, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.